Yin Yang English and the Crisis of Silence. Why Yin Yang English?
Yin Yang English arises from trying to address two important study deficits in Chinese students, who are commonly called on to achieve the kind of mental fluency in English, often in the context of the many Western tests which now sadly dominate and vitiate that clear realm of study which is, or ought to be, the birthright of any true university.
Which deficits do you mean?
Innate Chinese modesty and fear of making a mistake in a group context, that is to say, a tendency to timidness and shyness, constitute the first hurdle which Chinese students must overcome, if they are to keep up with and maybe eventually outshine their contemporaries in other cultural settings. I am calling this deficit the crisis of silence. Years ago, the Japanese suffered from the same inhibition. But in the last 40 years it would seem that they have experienced a sea change in regard to this issue, and now speak out, and speak up, as well as any European nation. The second deficit seems to arise from not knowing where to start mentally. In this context, one must ask, what models, and especially what spoken models, have Chinese students been called upon to experience and imitate? The answer is probably none at all in many cases, with the inappropriate, colloquial, remembered sounds of dialogues from more recent TEFL textbooks see these clearly not making any realistic contribution to resolving this crisis of silence, since such sources are always context-bound and make no pretense of offering any analytic view of where students' reasoning, in the act of beginning to speak, should begin.
I see. Why do you think these problems exist in the first place?
It would seem that China, especially at the high school level, has from time immemorial adopted old-fashioned, tedious, labor-intensive methods of language acquisition, and has allowed the idea that these are a sine qua non of expertise to arise in the minds of the students. Chinese students thus encounter English as a dead thing, a laboratory specimen for vivisection, if the root of that word with its sense of life does not preclude our using such a metaphor. When the same students reach the university stage, they find that the more sophisticated demands from tests such as IELTS have simply broadened the range of skill sets demanded. There is an overarching moral component, but that the fundamental roadblocks to real learning have not shifted.
Can you explain what brings about these blockages?
Certainly. I have already described inhibiting factors at the psychological, cultural and pedagogic levels, firstly in the demands made by the inherited, meritocratic, achievement and assessment-based system, a system which, I should say, I believe to be thoroughly misguided and anti-educational in the true sense of that word, and, by the same token, in the students themselves and the expectations they have based upon the demands made on them. But the greatest blockage to joy, flow and ease in study and language practice seems to lie precisely in the faulty conception of what the preconditions for fluency and command should be in the first place. Such a false view is found almost everywhere, east and west, and arises from an over-academicization of the problem of language study, and from basing global views of language on erroneous philosophical models.
Can you give some examples of these? For this is surely a crucial criticism.
Sure, I will try to. In general, it seems to me that the cup of victory in language studies is only handed out occasionally, and then only to exceptional athletes. Certain students do emerge, who are able to memorize everything, reason everything out, and thus finally disgorge what is necessary in its due place, perfectly, and trimmed of all excess. But such experts this term of praise is not too exalted. Generally learning without any conscious training from teachers or mentors of any kind, in the classical way, would seem to constitute a distinct and exceptional minority. I remember that this was the way of Sir Harold Bailey, the great Sanskrit scholar, who was fluent in dozens of languages, ancient and modern. Peter Avery writes of Bailey making a great pause and then finally summoning the desired word in the obscure language from the relevant compartment of his mind. And Louise, of course, refers to Sanskrit in a jokey and irreverent way in Arrival. But the tangerine is not the only fruit. Michel Thomas had a quite different way of proceeding. During the war, Thomas suffered torture but was able to block out the pain by appropriate mental focusing. After the war, he decided that inculcating languages would not only be a marvelous means of contributing, in the fullness of time, to world peace, but that another, related, special focusing of the mind might be invoked to bring forth linguistic fluency on a far shorter time scale, essentially harnessing the power of cognates in European languages, and making much use of mnemonics and fun prompts to the learner's memory. Thomas evolved an at first secret method which guaranteed a fluency of sorts in a matter of hours and days, rather than months and years. It was used for the coaching of many notable Hollywood actors. After Thomas's death in 2004, and a little prior to this, his system was commercialized, albeit unfeelingly, and extended to languages beyond the initial big four of Italian, Spanish, French and German. Despite the eccentricities of some of the imitators, the urbane Russian Michel Thomas method tutor famously imagines the ferry personnel at Dover announcing, "Car ashore," to the departing truck drivers, thus teaching us the Russian for good. Horatio, his system made a distinct impact in the first decade of our millennium, and has only lost traction due to the anti-globalized sentiment prevalent in the last half-decade.
Interesting enough. But do you accept Bailey's, or Thomas's, heuristic? You seem to damn them with faint praise.
Fair enough comment. Thomas's language historical insights and his playful methodology are pure gold. But his approach is rather didactic. He gets quite irate when students do not reason correctly. What we should question here is not his getting irate, but what he is asking to be recalled and worked out in the first place. He gives no explicit signposts which might help compensate for a memory lapse per se. Thus with Yin Yang English, the focus is always on conscious construction, relating words chosen to empty spaces awaiting words in a sentence template, so that any train veering off the tracks can speedily be reinstated in its journey from its last known station. What we are trying to achieve vis-a-vis Bailey is simply the method of recall which allows students' minds to bounce off far more visible and available and perceptible knowns. There is no need to go down the coal mine to retrieve the gold nugget. But a similar sense of descent may be triggered by the teacher's way of assuming, as a default setting, that the students should always be able to know and find. Where this does not happen speedily, it is only because they are just not looking in the right place.
Aha! So it is in this context that the essentially graphic communicative style of Yin Yang English comes into its own?
Precisely. The visual constructs in Yin Yang English are very homely, deliberately childish, charming, idiosyncratic, capable of reform, and provisional. So far we have at least a dozen elements whose permanence in the system seems assured, and a few others whose role already seems promising and acceptable to the students.
Sounds great. Maybe you can gloss yin and yang first?
Yin means shady, and has feminine connotations as being a place of yielding and receiving. Yang means male, strong, bright, and is ideal for the initiatory, bold, first declaration of any sentence, or at least, for the starting of any sentence which is instantiated as positive fact. If, on the other hand, we instantiate a story with a sentence whose embodiment arises only slowly and through the accretions of language, we are starting from a year premise. A long time ago, in the middle of a dark forest, lived a beautiful girl with golden hair, whose abode was a small thatched cottage. The first two clauses are adjuncts. A good test for adjuncts might be that they may be fitted onto a sentence at either end, without any loss to the sense. But then we have a girl, the exemplary aid, meaning that the girl in question must be defined, and this is archetypically you. The subject/verb inversion need not detain us long, and the next sentence will almost certainly be of a different character, and as it elucidates, should proceed from yang to you.
I think it was Arthur Koestler who spoke of time's arrow?
That is right. Time actually has a direction. We owe this insight, perhaps, to Hawking and Einstein, and time moves on as we speak, thus fatally interacting with what we say or write, and hence molding it, always forcing it across what we might describe as an event horizon and into its opposite polarity. The most obvious example of this might be the simplest imaginable subject-verb-object sentence. I give you a book. It is obvious that I is the postulate. Give is where there occurs an energy charge in the voltage of the sentence, and that a book lies way outside what we now know, in a new and different dimension. We do not know what book. Millions of millions must be imagined and excluded before we may know, and that cannot happen in this sentence. Therefore, the sense that the sentence has somehow crossed the threshold and has landed in some sort of temporary black hole, or even, and I prefer this, white hole, is not so stupid. It even sheds an obscure light, to borrow Joseph Conrad's wonderful phrase.
One might even say that language constitutes a foggy, gray hole.
Indeed, the provisionality, the vagueness, the lack of signposts in language cannot be stressed sufficiently. Language may innovate. The noun Brexit, for example, did not exist as recently as 5 years ago. Meanwhile, as is well known, other words go out of date. Celia Johnson's "There will come a time when I shan't mind." This is Laura speaking in brief encounter already has an archaic ring to it. But it is only 70-odd years old.
The idea of a language being subject to
minute
changes as we think it out, this is a new one, I guess. A happy one, maybe.
Well, yes. Because at any given moment we should know where we are on the given, constructed mental map, remembering that, at any given moment, and with each and every sentence, we are always passing from yang to yin, or from yin to yang.
Perhaps you can give some extended examples, including the graphics.
With great pleasure. We might take our examples from Celia Johnson in Brief Encounter and Amy Adams in Arrival.
I am ready.
B127 128 This can't last. This misery can't last. I would say, by way of introduction, that this isn't housing as traditionally understood. It would seem that housing was adopted from an intellectual template which had evolved for the study of Greek and Latin, and that this was adopted for English and German relatively early, perhaps around 250 years ago, without too much thought given as to its suitability for modern spoken language. To online sites, rewordify.com is one of them. Continue to perpetuate housing, ostensibly as a useful study tool in a color-coded and user-friendly way. Traditional housing is clunky, inasmuch as it gives disproportionate importance to small distinctions. For example, it glories in as many as 9 categories for different types of word, but of these, for smaller classes prepositions, conjunctions, interjections and exclamations may rapidly be subsumed into Yin Yang English's little words category, which can of course on demand be widened to take in other relevant words as well. Or we can go down the route of medium-sized and small little words. It really does not matter. The aim is not to obscurely demonstrate some kind of understanding by labeling existing words according to their type, but rather, following the medieval art of memory, to construct lucent and enduring mental spaces by using an amusing graphic locus where many potentially useful words may be imaginatively stored by the learner. Hence the many special fairy tale-like locuses, the first of which is inevitably the articles triangle. In B127 This can't last we have the articles triangle as a 3-dimensional solid in order to situate this in an appropriate place. The NT of can't arises from an incursion of negativeness from the thundercloud knot, and the sentence concludes beyond the Yang boundary with last. Can is given around a 30% score on the assentivity meter. In other circumstances, last might have been represented on the clock face of the assentivity meter, but since it concludes the sentence, its more salient characteristic is its closing and hence year roll. Notice that the assentivity meter gets around the old distinction between transitive and intransitive verbs, and the idea of the year closure of a typical sentence brings objects and complements under one heading. Again, typically, the ends of sentences, i.e. that which occurs after the assentivity meter's representation of the energy point in the sentence, are typically left unanalyzed. On demand, such fragments can be brought back to the LHS of the Yin-Yang schema and analyzed as floating heads of sentences, but I tend to discourage this, because it makes the Yang flow of sense, which is primordial, less obvious. B128 This misery can't last. Misery occupies the space quite near the apex of the articles triangle where the value is 0. The sentence starting misery might be diagrammed at an equivalent point in the wordscape. The purple Yang boundary has been added to the chart to show that one might argue for this sentence's Yin-Yang shifts as follows. 1. This Yang west of the first purple YY boundary. 2. Misery year first state east of the first purple YY boundary. 3. This misery Yang second state west of second major pale blue YY boundary before last. For this misery Japan Yang has number 3 last 2 as argued above. B129 I must remember that and try and control myself. This sentence consists of two clauses, all of the second of which is beyond the Yang boundary. I occupies the first position on the heptagram of person. Must is placed at the cogwheel, which works with the accentivity meter essentially to accommodate what are traditionally called auxiliary verbs. Here, Yin Yang English can also express the relative importance and tense stress, and may be also the tempo of utterance of words in a sentence. If we chose to place must directly in the accentivity meter, for example, by passing the cogwheel we would be stressing must, and remember would be relegated to the year margin. But the film makes a huge point about memory, especially in this sequence, which is seen twice, confounding the apparent temporal scheme of the film, hence our ordering. Yin Yang English thus relates directly to language in memory and not the merely plausible language of textbook examples. Martin Smith, March 16, 19